So, at some point, consciousness had to come into this. And I can think of no one better to introduce consciousness at this point, especially because of the, at least at the level at which Stuart wants to talk about it, and because of his work with Roger Penrose as well, then Stuart Hameroff. Stuart Hameroff is anesthesiologist, director of the Center for Consciousness Studies at the University of Arizona. And some of you here must have been to these Tucson conferences on consciousness. And Stuart was the lead organizer for those things and did a fantastic job of really getting us all thinking about these sorts of issues. He has collaborated with Roger Penrose on the development of what they call the OR theory of consciousness, which he may well explain in passing. And I think you're going to connect everything that's been spoken about so far into one little package, right?
I'm going to try.
Okay.
Thank you, Roger. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for still being here, everybody. Well, so far, to my way of thinking, most of this conference has been kind of like the Inquisition, but in reverse. The scientists are kind of frying the people who believe in religion. And I personally am not fond of organized religion, and I don't have a problem with bashing organized religion. However, I think that there is room in science for scientific spirituality, basically an interconnectedness, a reservoir of Platonic ethical values embedded in the fundamental level of the universe. This is the idea that Roger Penrose put forth in The Emperor's New Mind. And he doesn't go so far as to relate it to anything spiritual or religious, certainly. He kind of stops. But I think it's fair game to take what he said and extend it to some kind of underlying aesthetic and ethical Platonic values embedded in the fine structure of the universe. So, but then one must show how this level can connect to our relatively macroscopic brains. So with that in mind, the title of my talk is somewhat tongue-in-cheek, Quantum Consciousness Can Save the Soul. By soul, I mean this kind of spirituality, interconnectedness, and Platonic values embedded in the universe. So Descartes, of course, prior to Descartes, religion and science were pretty much on the same page in most things. And then Descartes, who said, of course, I think, therefore I am, the fact that he was conscious was the only thing he could be absolutely certain of. But consciousness, as we all know, is unobservable. So this gave rise to dualism. And it's kind of continued, actually. Those in neurosciences tend to explain away a lot of the things about consciousness. So the scientific aspect of this led to what we might lump as neurocomputation, basically brain equals mind equals computer, in which neuronal axonal spikes, synaptic transmissions are fundamental components like bit states and switches in computers. And some of the giants in that field are in this room. And this is based on dendrites receiving inputs from an axon, integrating and then firing to the next one. And with the chemical synapse being the fundamental unit in most ways of looking at it. However, as an explanation for consciousness, this view of neurocomputation has some problems. First of all, it is incompatible with the best measurable correlates of consciousness, gamma synchrony EEG, and the mechanism of action of general anesthesia. Also, it necessitates rendering consciousness as an after-the-fact illusion, an epiphenomenon with no causal power. As Thomas Huxley said, we are merely helpless spectators. And it precludes any scientific possibility of non-local interconnectedness, fundamental morality, and deeper meaning, the soul. Now, we could argue endlessly about these two things. And we've heard arguments that there is no such thing as a soul, and all this is a bunch of rubbish. And maybe we are helpless spectators and don't have any real-time conscious control. Maybe consciousness is an illusion put together after the fact and inserted in a memory, as Dan Dennett has described it. And it's difficult to prove either way on this, as we've heard. However, let's look at the science. Let's look at these problems that I'm claiming exist with neurocomputation for gamma synchrony EEG and general anesthesia. Now, in addition to chemical synapses, there's another type of electrical synapse in the brain and nervous system, electrotonic gap junctions. These are electrical synapses They form between dendrites, dendrite to dendrite, for example, also glial cells, and in some cases axons. And they make a different type of network within other networks within the brain. Here's a close-up, but you don't actually see it, but these are hollow cores. So these gap junctions are like docking modules between spaceships, if you will, so you could swim, if you're really small, from one neuron to the other. And these are, of course, the microtubules where Roger and I think consciousness is actually happening. But the point is that these electrotonic gap junctions are what mediate gamma synchrony. Specifically, dendritic gap junctions mediate gamma synchrony, the best neural correlate of consciousness. They form what you might consider as dendritic connections or lateral connections, shown here in this slide from Cahal's early work, and then dendritic interactions between pyramidal cells and interneurons and others in the cortex. And they come and go. They form a connection, they disappear, they come and go. So transient webs of dendritic gap junction connected neurons and glia can extend widely through cortex, and they mediate gamma synchrony. And I claim that this is the neural correlate of consciousness, these transient webs. And this idea was put forth by Sir John Eccles and Carl Prevram, that consciousness occurs in dendrites with axons providing input to and output from where consciousness is occurring. So if we look at a regular group of neurons with dendrites here, fire a spike, trigger this one, goes around in this circle. Obviously, there could be a lot of parallelism and so forth. But just if you were measuring, you'd see this voltage potential kind of traveling around. There's no coherence. Spikes are not coherent. However, the dendritic gap junction connections do give rise to gamma synchrony. So anywhere in the system where you measured, you'd see gamma synchrony. Where you have the dendritic gap junctions, there could be some glia involved, and so forth. So the point is, the best neural correlate of consciousness, gamma synchrony, depends on dendritic gap junctions, not neurocomputation as we normally think of it. I'm an anesthesiologist, and I put people to sleep every day and wake them up. And the best study that I've seen on brain monitoring during anesthesia and loss of consciousness was done by Eroy John and Leslie Pritchup last year. And they showed that loss of consciousness with general anesthesia correlates with loss of gamma synchrony between frontal and occipital cortex. So here's the absolute power in F3 and O1. So a frontal lead and an occipital lead. And just to cut to the chase here, if you look, this is induction. So the patient's awake, they go to sleep, loss of consciousness, they're maintained under general anesthesia, they begin to return to consciousness, and then they're fully awake. And the one thing that stands out, as you can see here, that correlates with consciousness is the coherence between the front of the brain and the back of the brain. And this is quite robust, and it's been repeated in rats, and of course we don't know for sure the rat is conscious when they wake up, but the point is that front to back and cross-hemisphere coherence in the gamma synchrony range is the best correlate of consciousness. Now, gamma synchrony derives from coherent conformational oscillations of dendritic membrane proteins regulated by quantum London forces. So what I'm saying is if you have dendritic membranes in different parts of the brain oscillating coherently, that means their voltage channels are oscillating coherently, and they are anesthetic sensitive proteins, and that means that their conformational state is controlled by electron dipoles within what are called hydrophobic pockets. And if they're in one orientation, the protein is in one shape. This could be an open channel, this could be a closed channel. It goes back and forth, coupled to the movements of these electrons. And these are quantum mechanical forces. Anesthetic gases work only by quantum forces. They form no chemical bonds in the body, and they're also quite selective. Patients under general anesthesia are unconscious, but if you do evoked potentials or measure EEG, their brains are quite active. We use evoked potentials all the time in spine surgery, and the brain is neurocomputing away in the absence of consciousness. What does disappear only is the gamma synchrony. And so anesthesia is selective for consciousness, sparing other brain functions, and they bind only by quantum interactions, quantum forces called London forces. So the other problem with gamma synchrony is that besides it not being mediated by conventional neurocomputation, it is not driven by thalamocortical pacing, recurrent feedback, reciprocal action potentials, and or synaptic transmissions. As I said, gap junctions, while necessary, cannot account for the zero phase lag coherence, the perfect, as far as one can measure, between front and back. So here we have gamma synchrony, and basically what's happening is that proteins in the front of the brain are oscillating coherently, and proteins in the back of the brain are oscillating coherently. And Walter Freeman and Giuseppe Vitiello, and in a separate paper, E. Roy John, concluded that normal neural processes shown here cannot account for this synchrony, and that some quantum effect must be at play in the brain to account for gamma synchrony. And even if you deny that gamma synchrony is the best neurocorrelative consciousness, it does occur, suggesting that something funny is going on. And quantum correlations, entanglements between the front and the back of the brain, mediate gamma synchrony and consciousness. And Walter was, as you probably know, is no big quantum fan. He just came to this conclusion by studying it. And I recommend this paper. Actually, I didn't put the citation, but I can send it to you. Anyway, proteins switching between two states, depending on quantum forces in their core, is the basis for the model that I developed with Roger Penrose, in which microtubules inside the neurons, particularly within dendrites, are performing quantum computations with themselves, with each other, and through gap junctions throughout the brain to account for consciousness. So if we were in this neuron looking through the gap junction, we'd see this other neuron. And if there were another gap junction here and here and here, this could spread throughout the entire brain. And one could have one continuous interior where quantum states could be protected and isolated and avoid decoherence. And this is something what it might look like with quantum states spreading between, from neuron to neuron through a gap junction. So that was the story about anesthesia and gamma synchrony, which Neuro Computation has a problem with. The other issue that I want to address that's more arguable in both directions is, are we helpless spectators? It's been known for many years. Max Vellman's published in 1991 on this, and Dan Dennett had it in his book in about that time. Evoked potentials apparently occur too late, 150 to 500 milliseconds after sensory impingement, to account for responsive actions initiated or completed within 100 milliseconds. So in other words, by the time we figure out what somebody said, or by the time we figure out what's happening, we've already responded. Normal conversation, choice planning of execution of voluntary acts, hitting a baseball pitched at 95 miles an hour. A guy wrote a book that says it's impossible consciously, even though the batters think they see the pitch at least halfway. So consequently, so subjectively, we feel as though we perceive and respond to these perceptions consciously. Consequently, subjective feelings of conscious control of these behavior is illusion. They are merely non-conscious reflexive responses. Dan Wegner, Dan Dennett, Terry Serjanowski said something to that effect in the U.S. News and World Report article a couple weeks ago. Accordingly, consciousness, according to the party line, Neuro Computation, is epiphenomenal. And we are, as Huxley said, conscious automata, helpless spectators, like Pac-Man. We're being controlled by, in this case, our unconscious selves, and we only think that we're conscious, and it's imprinted into memory that we were in control. That's Dan's idea. So is there any hope? Well, yes, and there's also data. And this is very old data from Ben Libet, and many people in this field are familiar with this set of experiments, which still defy easy explanation. Basically, he had patients having neurosurgery, craniotomy, with their brain exposed, but under local anesthesia so he could talk to them. And for example, he could stimulate the finger area of one cortex and also the same finger on the other side. And basically what he found was that direct cortical stimulation, if it resulted in what looks like gamma synchrony for 500 milliseconds, resulted in consciousness at the end of half a second. But if you stimulated the finger and got an evoked potential, followed by 500 milliseconds, it was felt at the time of the evoked potential. Now, he did some other studies with thalamic stimulation, which basically said that if you have the evoked potential but don't continue with the gamma synchrony for the full time, there's no conscious experience. So somehow it appears as if the brain or the body or somebody knows whether or not this is going to continue. Libet concluded that there's backward time referral of subjective experience from the time of what he called neuronal adequacy to the time of the evoked potential. Now, backward time is perfectly permissible for quantum information, quantum mechanics.